This isn't a transitory beating of somebody. This is something that will affect you forever. Dom?
Why is it appropriate knowingly to impoverish someone? Knowingly infect someone with HIV, and often they've got families growing into.
Firstly, we'd say we encourage people like single fathers for paying, their wives, and secondly, because they caused it, Dom. They're the ones who gave them AIDS. We think they have a moral obligation to pay them out. Moreover, we'd say, it forces them to be far more careful in the bedroom when there's such a financial disincentive not to have sex with you without a condom. No thank you. What happens when people get infected with HIV/AIDS? Firstly, they have to bear the substantial price of antiretroviral drugs. Even in the first world, where we have things like a pharmaceutical benefit scheme or a national health service, there's still a substantial financial contribution the victim has to make. Moreover, in countries like the United States, there isn't that system to cover those people. No thank you. Whilst we think it's important that you morally sanction someone for criminal procedures, ladies and gentlemen, we think that firstly, that doesn't address the need, but moreover, our model captures those who necessarily didn't break the law, those who didn't know they had HIV/AIDS. Yes, sir?
Would it be the case under your model that if you actually had sex and you or a condom and told your partner that you actually did have AIDS, you would still be liable?
Well, firstly, if you're wearing a condom, we don't think you're going to give them AIDS, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's a pretty basic concept of physiology. We'd say, ladies and gentlemen, that in those cases, the judiciary can often find solutions if they need to. They do it all the time right now. What I'm going to say, the problem in making this about knowledge, ladies and gentlemen, is that people have no way to consent to this sort of activity, ladies and gentlemen. It's unfair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Those who are HIV positive still have the right to engage in sexual activity, and undermining this right, as the proposition will do, is not only unjust, but also has practical harms. So today I'm going to be looking at these 2 points, why it's unjust and those practical harms, and telling you why what we've heard so far is not only confused, but also quite damaging. Okay, so first, to look at what we've heard so far. Well, we're not entirely sure how this is going to fit in with all healthcare systems that we set out from our Prime Minister's speech. The problem that individuals who are infected with HIV/AIDS are not physically or financially able to afford the drugs that they require to lead normal, healthy, not infected almost lives, ladies and gentlemen. That very obvious problem in healthcare systems was not talked about in her speech. What was also not talked about was the concept of changing sexual practices and making more people aware. And with that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at what she did talk about. Firstly, let's look at the moral concerns that she had in today's debate, which was her biggest attack. Secondly, let's look at this idea that sex is nice and good, and I'll give you a hot tip, I like sex too, guys. And very finally, let's look at this concept of how we change AIDS, because that fits very nicely with my material about raising the awareness of HIV/AIDS in a positive way, as is done under our proposal. So let's look at the moral.
But also they told us, and this is even more ludicrous, that HIV affects specific groups, like gay people, ladies and gentlemen. Well, this may be a surprise to you, ladies and gentlemen, but we think that gay people might happen to have sex with other gay people. So the entire group is hit by this. They're all screwed, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. And worse than that, you introduce the stigma. Because you say AIDS is the sort of thing which is something we always look at for responsibility. There's always recrimination. We're always thinking about not how can we best deal with this issue, how can we deal with the fact that this person has AIDS, but whether or not there's someone else who's culpable. We think that kind of culture isn't particularly a useful one to encourage within our community. But now let's talk about the incentives to improve behaviour. And I proudly stand in opposition today.
What I want to bring you from closing is the idea that sex should always be seen as a joint venture between 2 parties, but there should never be a situation of sex where costs are imposed simply on one individual and not on both, and we think that's fundamental. And secondly, we'll explain why HIV is a special case, both in terms of its cost and in terms of the fact that it's particularly serious. But firstly, I want to deal with what we got from opening opposition, because it was just so crazy, ladies and gentlemen. But the entire logic of their case was that, these, ranty attack on the people who got AIDS or HIV won't be able to have sex anymore. That's just just not true, ladies and gentlemen. We're not denying them their right to have sex. We're saying because they have HIV, they have differential responsibilities than people who don't have HIV. And under those circumstances, they have to take, they have to be aware of those consequences. It might lead to someone else having to live the rest of their lives on drugs, and that decision needs to be a shared decision, a consensual decision, and in fact both people have to have a stake in that decision. We think that's really fundamental that they have that discussion. We're not denying them their right to have sex. Don't think that this totally stigmatizes anyone with HIV, which is just confusing, ladies and gentlemen. Like, we just don't see why there's any normative element at all in this policy. This just simply says the fact of you having HIV makes your life different to the fact of not having HIV. And thank you. So you can't just put your head in the sand and say, let's pretend like no one has HIV, even if you do. It does change your life. We don't think there's a normative element of stigmatizing them, but we say there is an element, then you need to take greater care and greater responsibility. But also, if you really believe in this stigma argument, that's actually an argument for our side, because yes, especially in societies that are already, which is what they said, societies where people with HIV are already stigmatized, that possibly means those people at the point where they contract HIV probably can't pay. We think at the point where people will suddenly say, their families won't look after them, their friends won't look after them, say, you've got HIV, you're the sort of person we don't want to pay for. We think that makes it an additional burden on the state to help them out. And thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not quite sure what goes on in the bedroom at Oxford, but if it involves the language of contract and mutual responsibility, quite frankly, I'm a little disturbed. In this debate, what we're going to be bringing you is three distinct things. The first thing that we're going to be doing to you, perhaps, is analysis of why, in terms of its intersection with the law, this policy is baseless in comparison to some very basic principles of justice. The second thing that we're going to be doing is showing that the problem and the potential benefits these guys point to are so illusory at best that we think this motion falls. The third thing we're going to be looking at is how, with specific reference to victims, this is actually a policy that is not in their interest. But to the first thing that I want to talk about. The first thing that we argue in today's debate, ladies and gentlemen, is that we think a fundamental principle to the justice system is that people don't get punished twice. We totally agree with people being put in prison when they knowingly infect others with HIV, but we would suggest that if they're doing that time, they don't need to be doubly punished in this instance. But secondly, we would suggest there's always going to be a pretty basic problem of them being able to afford the drug treatments if they're in prison. Like, you can't just make enough number plates to pay for antiretroviral treatments, ladies and gentlemen.
Unfortunately, Chris stood up and just didn't understand what tort law is, or what negligence law is, ladies and gentlemen. This is about conversation. It's about a social policy to address the long-term damages to a person in a contractual relationship, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think Chris can stand and say, well, this doesn't fit into our principles of criminal justice, and ignore the fact that we actually made this about civil law, ladies and gentlemen. We made this about social contributions, and intent actually doesn't matter, ladies and gentlemen, when you consider things like negligence. So I'm going to speak to two things, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about how I visualise sex happening. And I'm going to look at various conceptual frameworks, ladies and gentlemen, on that. Second of all, I'm going to get a practical fallout, ladies and gentlemen, of this policy, and the alleged practical arguments they've made. So first of all, let's look at how we visualise sex happening on this side of the house. And we say, yeah, perhaps maybe it's telling that we don't have much sex in Oxford. What I do think, ladies and gentlemen, it's really important, and it's also something we brought to the table, that we conceptualise sex as a contractual arrangement, ladies and gentlemen. That when you go and you say to someone, I want to have sex with you, you also say, I implicitly bear all the consequences of the sexual act, ladies and gentlemen. We say it's pretty irresponsible for you not to get checked. No, thank you. We say in our law, everyone should get checked if you're going to be a sexually active person. And in response, ladies and gentlemen, even if there's a 0.2% or whatever chance of you, even if you use a condom, ladies and gentlemen, and this is the basis of their opposition, that you can use a condom, you can take all their practices and still be punished for this. But we say tough. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, you implicitly accept all the consequences. That's why I think if you use a condom and with a woman and you produce a baby, ladies and gentlemen, if it might happen, we say it's not a good offence for you to say, oh, you use the condom. We say you still index child support payments. So that's the nature. That's the nature of who you get into. It's all the things which makes us human, ladies and gentlemen. It's a key part of who we are. These guys are absolutely right. That's why I say that principle doesn't stand. Then there was this weird sort of right to sex argument, which morphed into this is a bad policy because it shifts our way of thinking about sex and therefore it limits our way of thinking about sex. We say it makes people more responsible, like said to you 1 second, then we say it's a good thing. We say that's an argument against all the child support arguments which they support in their side of the house. They just use an argument against some people having sex with animals or children or their brothers and sisters. We say it's not really a strong argument to argue this somehow limits people's ability to have any type of sex they want. Go. Okay, look, for a start, ladies and gentlemen, when we say it's not a situation where you have a victim and then you have the person who's raped them, you have to go up to them and beg them. And this is what Chris said, it creates a psychological dependency because you have to go to the person who you're in charge, who caused you to have that particular form of HIV. We said the state compels you to do so. The state takes money away from you and places it in the hands of the victim. So we don't say there's that link there, ladies and gentlemen. You get money from a person who commits an act against you. We say most people who've been raped and who contract HIV, ladies and gentlemen, probably would be happy with getting that particular type of payment. Bear in mind the high cost of HIV treatment. We don't think that's really a good point. And then the third argument under this issue of how we use sex is this incentives argument, ladies and gentlemen.
Be treated for AIDS. In their model, that just so happens that often those people who can't afford treatment may be unfortunate mistake of accidentally affecting someone with AIDS. So it's not like they're treating everyone. Secondly, the idea that AIDS is meant to make people need drugs just means that someone should pay. And actually, under the status quo, in the majority of first world countries, they already get compensation from medical payments from the government to treat them. So, and this was Chris's point he wants to respond to. What their model does is it shifts the burden off the state to make sure that people have access to healthcare and puts it on the perpetrators of crime to make sure that people get healthcare. That's just a recipe for people, and the failure of childcare systems to ensure that single mothers where the father has to pay child support payment, the failure of that system demonstrates when the state washes its hands and puts it on victims, generally people suffer. So we don't think that they actually make sure people get treated for AIDS. And finally, we'd actually say that when it also comes to the long-term health of patients, we actually think the psychological hold that perpetrators of crimes get over their victims can often offset any of the gains that they've suggested. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, they've tried to sort of claim the moral high ground by saying people with AIDS have a really, really bad life, so someone should pay. And we agree, but we just think embracing a model that doesn't guarantee their health and undermines the state's capacity to help them, whilst undermining the justice system too, ultimately fails. And for those reasons, we're proud to oppose.
To all of the debaters. I'd like to invite the adjudicators to try to confirm.